What do you want to be when you grow up? It's a question that we're asked a lot over the course of our lives, so that one day when we have to go and pick a college major, maybe it's just a tiny bit easier. It's something that every kindergarten has to figure out because obviously you should know in kindergarten what you're going to be for the rest of your life. It's only reasonable. Needless to say, I think every single one of you is extremely familiar with this question, but I'd just like to go through the various ways that who I wanted to be as I grew up kind of changed throughout my time. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I was a kid that would make a decision and stick to it. And so when I was very young, I decided that I liked animals. And when I learned that there was a profession that was strictly dealing with animals and strictly helping animals, I decided that that's what I wanted to be. My very first answer that I can remember, my parents can confirm or deny, is that I wanted to be a veterinarian when I grew up. And I didn't know how to spell this very well, but I would still attempt in my very best spelling to try and write out veterinarian and get some weird jumble of letters that people would either mistake with like some sort of army person or maybe an animal lover. And this idea of wanting to be a veterinarian was extremely pervasive in my identity. I would tell everyone, I'd be like, hey, I want to be a veterinarian because I'm going to save the animals. Like, hey, you see that cute dog over there? Yeah, I'm going to save it one day. You're not because you're going to be some doctor or some engineer or something. But I'm going to be a veterinarian and I am going to save that animal because I am just that great. It got to the point when I got to middle school that I was even scouting out potential locations to be a veterinarian at. There was these various clinics that I occasionally would see and I'd be like, yeah, I could imagine like living right next to my parents and then working there and then just having this great life that's very much like the one I have now, except I'd also be like an animal superhero who would be able to just save so many lives. And this went on through middle school and ended up culminating in this idea of a pet sitting business. Sort of something that I could use as experience on a resume to apply to either colleges or just to a job, which was where my head was at that point. I thought that by running a pet sitting business, not only could I make some money, but I could get some valuable experience that would one day help me to excel in my chosen profession. So I went ahead, created a pet sitting business, which is, quite frankly, that whole ordeal is a video for another day. But all you need to know is that ultimately that failed because one day my dad took me aside and told me that you should have a license for something like a pet sitting business to be legal. And I then decided that I didn't want to do something illegal and effectively shut down my pet sitting business, Possum Pet Sitting. It was a very sad day in my history. So, moving on from middle school to high school, a new factor entered my life. In middle school, I had begun taking one of these speech classes, speech and debate, and then going into high school, my friend Maggie introduced me to these Phoenix Wright games. And playing through these was so much fun. Essentially, you play as a defense attorney, and your job is to prove that your innocent client is innocent. And you would have to go up against all of these different prosecutors, and I did have a favorite prosecutor named Edgeworth, and essentially I decided that I wanted to be a prosecutor because I very much admired the ideals that this prosecutor was going into his profession with. As any good Japanese game, the villain had these very relatable sort of backstory type things. His dad was killed and then he was forced to become a prosecutor by this evil dude. But I still sympathized with the idea that there are bad people in the world and some of them deserve to go to jail. It was something that I sympathized a lot more with than being the one that protected people necessarily, as I did enjoy being kind of that devil's advocate position and more of being like the savior, and being apparently the savior of a lot of people by taking out a criminal was more appealing to me than being the savior of one person and their family by being a defense attorney. Regardless, when I got into high school and one of my teachers asked that all too often asked question, "What do you want to be when you grew up?" that answer had suddenly changed from the unspellable veterinarian to a prosecutor. To which my teacher kind of did a double take and they're like, "A prostitute?" And I'm like, "No, a prosecutor." And they're like, "Ah." Yeah, that teacher was weird, looking back. But yeah, so there I started to think about legal stuff and wanting to kind of go into that spectrum, political science and all of that. But the problem was I wasn't very politically active, and at the end of the day, I was still extremely good at science. And I was getting all these accolades and all this stuff for science. Everyone always said, you're really good at this. I could self-study an AP exam and get a good score. I constantly got good science scores. I was great at it. Meanwhile, in my speech and debate class, MUN, I kept not getting the awards I wanted. I didn't get first place. I got second, that sort of thing. But that was enough to kind of skew my interests back towards the biology, back towards the almost veterinary kind of point of view, to the point where when I saw one video about this experiment on something called Dolly the sheep, I was forever changed. For those of you that don't know, Dolly the sheep is essentially a cloning experiment, a real-life cloning experiment that actually worked. When I watched this video, it was like seeing science fiction come into real life, and it was absolutely insane to me. I became super interested in genetics. Everything that was happening in genetics was super intriguing to me because this is literally changing the very basis of life and changing how it works and changing how everything works. It's something that attacks something so basic and can address so many problems. Learning how to manipulate genetics is essentially like having a superpower because it can solve the exact same problems and even more complicated problems than a superhero ever could. And so, as I kind of got a little bit away from that sort of speaking side and got more towards the whole biology sciences side, I decided that a good fit for me in college would be to research genetics, going into a major called molecular cellular biology, which, among other things, studies genetics. And as I started writing all these applications to all of these schools, and I started thinking even more about this and where I wanted to be exactly, I decided that I didn't want to be in a lab my entire life, or at least that wasn't the ideal. It would be cool, I suppose, to work on all those projects, but maybe not what I would most prefer to do. And so that speaking part kind of crept back in there, and I started thinking, well, I'm good at the sciences, but I'm also fairly good at speaking, and there's not too many people that are good at both. And so what if I combine those things? A passion for genetics and an ability to convey that passion articulately. And I decided that what I wanted to do was go into something that I call the ethics of genetics. Essentially, nowadays, what I want to be when I grow up, as an 18-year-old talking now, is someone who helps with national and international legislation on genetics. Sort of like, what should you genetically modify, how should you genetically modify it, and all of that good stuff, which I feel is going to become extremely relevant in the future of genetics and science and humanity in this world going forward. So yeah, that's where I've landed today. That's where I went and talked about to my counselor, who gave me a little bit of a weird look, but also understood where I was coming from, and that's where I hope to be in a while. Someone who is able to help others through getting legislation that effectively regulates and, in regulating, enables genetics to be used effectively to solve problems like world hunger or even climate change or whatever. Because as I mentioned, genetics fixes things at such a fundamental level that it can spread out to like everything. It can just make everything change. And so yeah, that's what I've chosen. That's my journey from being a veterinarian who couldn't even spell veterinarian to being a sort of like prosecutor, law major, to being just someone interested in genetics, to being someone who's hoping to kind of do the legality of genetics. And you know what? Maybe I'll save some puppies along the way. Maybe that'll be something I'll be able to do. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know down in the comments below what things you have wanted to be when you grew up and how that's changed or whatever. Leave a like or subscribe if you are so inclined. I appreciate every subscriber equally. You are all very close friends to me, as you know most of my stories.